Proponents of rational expectations argue that failing to account for people's revised expectations lead to estimates of the sacrifice ratio that were too high. So the answer is true or false. So here, when we're talking about this, as the idea that revised expectations and sacrifice ratio is something that we talk about with this cost of reducing inflation, which is covered at the very end of this class, is this idea that of reducing inflation expectations. If people revise those expectations quickly, it's going to lead to a smaller sacrifice ratio. So some people have calculated sacrifice ratio over time. If they fail to account people's revised expectations, we'll say that it's going to be a very lengthy process and it's going to cost a lot in terms of foregone GDP. So proponents of rational expectations argue that failing to account those expectations lead to estimates of the sacrifice ratio that were too high. That is true. That's what they argue. The actual sacrifice ratio is really hard to calculate in practice. You could get an idea, and that's why we avoid letting the inflation rates get out of control. But overall, it all depends how people revise their expectations, how quickly they revise it. If they revise it quickly, the sacrifice ratio will not be that bad. In the long run, if the Bank of Canada decreases the rate at which it increases the money supply, what will happen to inflation and employment? So if we go back, even as far back as the quantity theory of money equation, we know that if we decrease the rate of growth of money supply, it's also going to lead to a drop in the rate of growth of the price level, the prices in the economy. So this is what we expect. We expect inflation to be lower. So it would be one of these answers. And here we're talking about the long run. So in the long run, as people adjust to this lower money supply and this lower inflation, unemployment should not change. We're not talking about the short run effect that as this adjusts, maybe unemployment may be higher temporarily. This is the long run effect. When aggregate demand increases, what happens to prices and employment? Well, this is pretty straightforward. If you just go to that graph with aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply, well, if aggregate demand increases and shifts right, we're talking here, they're not talking about long run. It's going to lead to an intersection with the AS curve that's going to be higher and to the right, which means that prices will rise and there'll be more output, but more output is also a synonym of saying that unemployment will fall. If you say, well, we already only had natural unemployment, well, you could have lower levels of natural unemployment because people that are seeking a good job may have so many around that they won't search too long and will just jump on one of those really good jobs fast. According to classical macroeconomic theory, what does money growth influence in the long run? And there's been a graph for that showing percentage change in money growth on a yearly basis, and on the other axis was inflation. And inflation is only a nominal variable. If it would influence real variables in a good way, a lot more countries would be using a lot of money growth. But in reality, it really influences only price and nominal variables. Faced with an adverse supply shock, so if you look at that aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph once again, adverse supply shock is not a positive supply shock, it's a bad one. So it's the aggregate supply curve shifting up or to the left is the way to see it. So we'd be going through a recessionary output gap. An adverse supply shock could be an increase in the price of oil or another input to production. So that would shift aggregate supply to the left. Well, how could policymakers intervene? So here we have government intervention. Well, they can stimulate aggregate demand by shifting it to the right. But if you were to draw it all out, you would see that now by shifting it to the right, we would have to accept higher prices to get a higher level of output to come back to potential output. So they can increase aggregate demand. Government intervention always influences aggregate demand, which increases price and output. Hopefully that clarifies the questions from Chapter 16.